it is hard because it's also hard to know, like, who do you trust? I mean, now that anybody can like write a blog, with
Yeah.
any background and any expertise, like whose take do you trust? And that is really tricky. And
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Parenting Understood. We're thrilled to have Melinda Wenner Moyer join us today to talk about her work, both in terms of the articles that she's done and her long career being a journalist, as well as her most recent book. So thank you so much for joining us today.
hi, thanks for having me.
I'm super excited for this conversation as someone who, and just like Michelle, loves research, but also loves thinking about how sometimes we can take research out of, the peer-reviewed journal articles and talk about it in sort of real world context. So just a very huge fan of your work doing that. So
Thank you.
thank you. So I think something that, we're both curious about, and I'm sure our listeners are curious about, is sort of in your career path, how you chose to really focus on, taking in scientific research on child development and parenting and focusing on that in particular, versus all the other myriad of things you could have done.
Yeah, well, so I've been a science journalist now for 15 years. And at the beginning, I really wasn't doing anything related to child development. I was like covering, new developments in genetics and molecular biology and neuroscience and medicine. And I still do cover, pure science some too, but it all changed when I had kids. This was 10 years ago. So I have a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old. And when my 10-year-old was born, I just had so many questions and I felt like I could not get clear answers from anyone. Like I would ask, two friends something and I would get two different answers. And, my parents would say something different from my sister, who would say something different from like, other people, and Google would tell me conflicting information. So like, I really struggled to know just answers to basic questions about essentially like how to keep my kid alive. And I wondered at that point, like, could science help me answer these questions? And I really didn't know. So I started looking and I found there was tons of research on like all different aspects of parenting and child development that was really informative to answer my questions. And so that was the point when I started thinking like this could be useful to share with the public. And I started writing a parenting column for Slate that was really like a science-based parenting column where I answered my own questions, being paid a little bit to answer my own questions. And that's sort of where it started. And then, as my kids got older, I found that like the kinds of questions I wanted answered were different. They like started out with, how do I keep my kid alive? And what do I do when they have an ear infection and things like that? And then shifted more towards like, how do I make sure I'm raising like a good human being? And how do I make sure they don't grow up to be racist? And like these bigger sort of character driven questions. And that was really kind of like what morphed into me deciding to write the book, was realizing that like a lot of parents had these bigger sort of value and character driven questions. And also like within this context of, I felt like the world, there was like a lot of bad behavior happening and like Me Too allegations were coming to light, and, adults were not treating each other very kindly and hate crimes were going up. And I was seeing all this happening and thinking like, how do I make sure that my kids don't grow up to be terrible people? And that was like the impetus where I was like, I think I want to write a science-based book on how to raise essentially like good human beings.
I think that's amazing because as a parent of a 13-year-old as well, and somebody who loves the science, I kind of felt like comforted when she was little because it seemed like there was almost like okay, do this and like she'll survive, like you were saying.
Yeah.
But by the time it was like she was 7, 8, and you're sort of, they're sort of also grappling with these larger questions and concerns, there just wasn't that much out there in terms of how to support them. So I think this is so great and so needed.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's crazy because I feel like there's so many books too that are really focused on like little kids and, how do you deal with toddlers? But then there's like this dearth of resources for kids who are, tween or even like school aged and tween and teens. And yeah, I felt like there was kind of this gap that like that could be helped fill a little bit.
Yes, no, I think it's so necessary. So I'm sort of curious, when you're in the sort of the midst of all the scientific research and sort of combing through everything. How do you take that work and say, okay, I'm going to actually translate this to be, have practical application for parents and for children? Like, what are sort of some of the things that you consider when you're doing that?
Yeah, it's really hard. I I mean, this is probably a luxury that I have that most parents don't. When I was working on the book, was I I could go to databases and look up like what are kind of all the studies I can find on a particular issue, and really try to like comb through and read, a bunch of studies, like dozens of studies, and think of them in this sort of broader context of like, what does the scientific consensus say on something? And that's very different from like taking one study and looking at it and saying like, okay, I'm going to take this finding and assume it's true for everyone, and that it's, that it's like universally relevant. And so I think the problem is like a lot of times I find as a journalist, I see that there will be some like surprising study that comes out, and because journalists love covering surprising things, and it'll be kind of counterintuitive, and it'll get covered as like, oh, this completely upends our understanding of X, and now this changes everything. And really, it's just like one study, and maybe the rest of the research in the field actually kind of contradicts it. And so I think it's really important to be able to think of the broader, like the broader research base, and how a particular finding fits into like the consensus. So like one example of that, I don't know if it was in the news a lot, but there was a study that came out that out of Tennessee that suggested that kids who enrolled in pre-K did worse over time had worse test scores in third through sixth grade than kids who didn't attend pre-K. And this study came out a few weeks ago, and it was covered like, oh my gosh, maybe pre-K is bad for kids. And, like it's one study, and there's a lot of complicated research in this field. And really, when you think of it in the context, that's not really the conclusion you want to make. So I guess what I'm saying is it's really hard, because you can't just take like one finding and say, okay, I'm going to transform my parenting and this is going to change everything, because it could be that that's not representative of what, the science overall suggests, because different studies can have different strengths and different weaknesses. And you have to kind of like look at it in this sort of bigger picture, and you don't want to overinterpret like one particular finding. So I guess that's not really all that helpful, but it's hard. It is really hard.
No, I think it is really helpful. And I think, sort of the Tennessee study, which did bring up so many, I think, issues for parents and researchers, sort of alike. But, thinking about the importance of context, like you're saying, right? And sometimes that gets lost. At least I feel like sometimes it gets lost when science is translated to, more sort of either practical applications or for an audience that's not scientific themselves. And they, all that nuance gets lost because you want to almost like find like the answer to whatever the question is. But often, right, there isn't an answer. It depends. Or
yeah, right. And the details of the study might really matter. Like with that pre-K study, you really, like pre-K can look so different depending on where you are. And so were those findings, are they really applicable to pre-K as a whole, or is it just specific to pre-K in Tennessee? And what does the pre-K look like in Tennessee? And is it really following what the science says about, what a good preschool has and does? And so there are all these kinds of things you have to sort of consider, but that can be really hard if you're not somebody who, knows the research field really well, and you're just looking at this one study. Like it can be really hard to know what's relevant and what should I consider, and how does this really relate to my kid?
totally.
I'm really glad that you brought up this example in the Tennessee study, because I had a lot of my friends that are in a position, they have a toddler they're considering preschools, and they're like, what do you think about this? Like, and for them, it's exactly how they took it. They saw a headline, did news source, and they're like, oh, like, should I trust my pre-K program? And so what would you tell those parents that maybe don't have like big picture, and they don't have the full picture of all of the research that's out there that's been done on pre-K programs? Like, where would you encourage them to kind of have that information and that basis?
I mean, I think journalists can be a really good resource in this particular situation, where if you know that there are journalists who really are entrenched in a particular beat, like in education, and maybe they write about the new study and they can put it into context for you, then that's a good place to look, instead of like going straight to the study or going to some really kind of like alarmist or crazy headline, to then like do some research and say, okay, well, what is what are some really trustworthy sources saying about this new study? And so maybe you could go like to some of the really great education websites and say, like, how are they putting this into context? How are their journalists interpreting this? And trying to find people who really can bring in that context that you might not be able to find. And I think that's the value that like science journalists and education journalists can really bring to the table, is like, that's their job, right? To really understand the historical context and everything you need to be able to to understand the implications of a particular finding. So yeah, I would like go hunt for good articles about the new findings and see if they have nuances and they have caveats that help you.
I love that suggestion. I think sometimes, I mean, this is my own personal issue, but sometimes I forget to send folks to really good journalists and media outlets. It's sort of like this first instinct of like, look at the study yourself, but it's so hard when you don't have like that's not your career, to interpret a lot of this work. And it's like figuring out the folks who interpret it really well and trusting their
Yeah. But it is hard because it's also hard to know, like, who do you trust? I mean, now that anybody can like write a blog, with any background and any expertise, like whose take do you trust? And that is really tricky. And so that's why sometimes, doing the research to see like, well, where was this posted and what is the background of this particular person who's writing about this? And, do they seem like they have a trustworthy expertise? Yeah.
Linda, I think I'm on your mailing list. And so I read all your emails. They're great. And I believe you did want an article on this in terms of teaching older children how to critically look at the news. Isn't that accurate?
Yes, I did. Right. So I did a lot of research for an article that came out a few months ago for Scientific American magazine, all about media literacy, like how do we teach media literacy to kids and what does the research say? And it was a really complicated piece to write because there's actually a lot of disagreement in the field of media and news literacy. Like we don't really know the best ways to teach this to kids, but there are also some things that, that do seem consistent and the research does point to in terms of like what we can do. And there's a lot of things we can do. But I think one thing is encouraging kids to ask questions, like when they are looking at a piece that they found on the internet or some information and say, okay, where did this information come from? And, what do we know about the source? And is that source trustworthy? Like all these, basically the same questions I was just saying. And, figuring out too, like how to do research on a particular source to know whether they're trustworthy and how it can be helpful to, if you're reading something on a particular blog, to actually like Google that blog and see, have there been articles written about the person behind it? Or, is there something that would be helpful to know about their background that other places have covered? And sort of really just doing research on the source itself and whether that's trustworthy.
I love that suggestion. As a mom of a teen, I'm just thinking, sometimes it's so hard to encourage her to be a critical thinker. Like sometimes I just find myself being like, that's not accurate. Like, don't believe what you're reading on that blog or whatever. But instead, the sort of taking a step back and giving her the tools to be able to do that herself, right, is so important.
Right. Yeah, it is, but it's hard. There's just so many things we have to teach our kids, right? And that's like one more thing and one more very important skill, but it's complicated. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, another topic, but parenting is exhausting.
It's so exhausting. It's so exhausting, especially now.
Yeah. I have to admit, before we went on, I was reading your article in the Atlantic about sort of moms and their, experience during COVID, and I could relate so deeply to their experiences.
Yeah, I know. Especially parents of kids under 5 right now, I just feel so much. And Erin, you have a 2-year-old, right? So like just not having vaccines. I mean, it's so hard for so many parents right now. Yeah.
Yeah, we're sort of all in this boat together to an extent, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, you mentioned that you kind of wrote your first book because you wanted to think about like what was surprising in research about raising children. And I know there's so many surprising things, but sort of, I think Michelle and I were curious, if you had to say the most surprising thing that you came across, what would that be?
Yeah. So I would say one of the big themes that kept coming up as I was researching the book and looking at these sort of like discrete subtopics within this bigger topic of raising, good kids was the power of emotional literacy, like, and the importance of just letting kids have their feelings, which I think can be really, really hard for parents. When our kids are upset, when they're crying or when they're scared or when they're sad, like we want to rescue them. We want to tell them, no, don't be sad. You're fine. Like, don't cry. I mean, my mom still says that to me if I'm like tearing up. She's like, don't cry, don't cry. And, it's just like a natural tendency. We don't want our kids to be upset. We want to kind of rescue them. But that is not the most constructive approach. And that was really interesting. There's a whole body of research suggesting that when we kind of respond in negative ways to our kids' negative emotions, when we tell them like, calm down, et cetera, we're doing a couple things. I mean, one is like, we're kind of robbing them of their emotional experience. We're telling them what you're feeling isn't valid. You shouldn't be feeling this way. And that, is unsettling for a kid. And it feels like, I'm not being heard. And maybe what I'm experiencing isn't okay to experience. And it's just, it's unsettling and it's not the most supportive thing we can be doing in the moment. But also, the more that we allow our kids to have feelings and talk about feelings, the more we help them develop a few skills, one of which is called theory of mind, which is really, really important for the development of generous behavior. And so theory of mind is essentially like the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes and to be able to perceive that somebody else might be feeling or experiencing something different from what you experience. And it's a pretty complicated skill to develop. I mean, it happens throughout childhood and some kids develop it sooner than others, but theory of mind is really important for kids to be able to be helpful and be generous. And that's because like if your child's friend is upset, for instance, and let's say your child wants to do the most helpful thing to help that friend who's in distress, they have to really be able to look at that friend and say, okay, based on their body language, based on their facial expressions, what is my friend feeling? Like, what is that emotion they're feeling? And when I feel that way, what do I want? So like, what can I give to my friends that I think will be helpful? And in order to do all of that, you really have to have this like strong emotional literacy base. And you have to, know what feelings feel like and know what they look like and know kind of what all the different emotions are. And the best way to develop that really is for parents to like talk about emotions, let kids have emotions and have these conversations about feelings, which I think is like a very counterintuitive thing, because again, we don't like it when our kids are upset and we're often like trying to shut that down. But turns out that the opposite is actually what's most helpful.
That's really interesting. And I agree. I mean, I think sometimes as a parent, that's like almost the hardest thing to do is like allow your child to sit with emotions that aren't always comfortable. At least I find that as a parent. But the importance of it.
Yeah. I mean, it is really hard. And sometimes our kids get so upset about things that we feel like aren't a big deal at all. Like my son he was playing like some FIFA game on Nintendo against my husband. And when he lost, he was so upset. And, my husband is like, get a grip, right? Like, why are you so upset? It's just a game. But like, yeah, but that's an example where, even though maybe we don't understand why it's so hard for them, like the feeling is genuine and the feeling is real. And when we tell them it's not okay to feel that way, like that is kind of undermining their authentic emotional experience. And that doesn't feel good for them. So, but it is so hard. It's so hard.
It's interesting you bring this up, the theory of mind, because there's a shift happening for your old daughter right now. In the last couple of days, I've noticed, she'll do something. She was doing something yesterday with her dad. And, he very calmly and gently, at least I thought was like, oh, no, he provided a correction. And she immediately went to her bedroom, into her bed, covered her head and crying. And I was like, are you okay? And she's like, I can't stop crying. I want to stop crying. I can't stop crying. And I found that really, really difficult for me. I was like, it's okay to cry. It's okay to have tears. It's okay to have feelings. But she perceived it as a negative thing. And we try really hard in this house to, all emotions are okay. Let's just wait it out and come out when you're ready. And I'm always here. But even that was really, really hard for me to see her trying to like restrain tears, and like kind of hiding. Like I don't want to show people that I don't want to show people that I live with in my house that I'm upset.
Yeah, right. And they're getting so many messages from our culture, especially boys, but girls too. Like it's not okay to have these feelings. It's not okay to show your feelings. And so it is really hard because I think we when we're doing the opposite, we're pushing against this very strong cultural narrative, and they're still going to get those messages from their friends, from their teachers, maybe from school. And so we can't like completely overrule it and undo it, but we can try. It's like we're just like pushing against this force, like a little bit at a time, and doing what we can to say no, it is okay to have the feelings. But yeah, we're still going to see the signs that like they're getting the opposite message from the rest of the world.
So I'm just curious, when you talk to parents about scientific research, do you ever find that folks are like, what is being done in research or what research is saying doesn't really resonate with our experience of parenting? Like, is there sometimes just like a disconnect that you see as to what's being done in the research or what the research is finding and what sort of real world how it often plays out in the real world?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think real world is just so much more complicated, right? So sometimes maybe there'll be some like nugget from a study, like let kids have feelings or something like that. And that's some very like broad, big picture thing. And then in the moment though, as a parent is trying to apply this, it becomes much more convoluted and complex. And there's all these other things that, are kind of getting in the way, or other conflicting messages sometimes you might have heard, that just makes it really, really hard to know, like, well, how do I take that and apply that to this particular moment in time? Like, what am I supposed to do right now? Like, for instance, let's say your kid is upset and, that like, it's important to let them have those feelings, but then they're also like doing something in response to having those feelings that's not okay. Like they're throwing books across the room, or they're like hitting their sibling. And so you're sort of like, well, wait, I'm supposed to let them have their feelings, but also I don't think it's okay that they're hitting their sibling. And so like, how do I respond in a supportive way, but also correct this? And, I think that that's one big problem, is that just in the moment, the situation can feel infinitely more complex than whatever little like nugget of truth you get from the research. And so that's really hard. And I also I think too, like it's relatively new phenomenon. I feel like that we even considered like the power of science to answer parenting questions. And I think that's just like a new-ish phenomenon that maybe some parents are kind of getting used to, because I think so much of the advice that we've followed over the centuries is like things that have been passed down through families. And, what did my mom do? And how would she have handled this? And so turning to something like science is sort of like this new and kind of weird thing for a lot of parents. And maybe because too, some of it is counterintuitive, and it isn't what our parents would have done, and it isn't what maybe our instincts tell us to do, that sometimes it's like hard to trust. Like, well, should I, like, for instance, talking to kids about race and racism. I think so many white parents in particular have grown up and have thought about this as like, the best thing to do is to not talk about race. Because if I talk about race, then maybe my kids will become racist. And this is like a phenomenon that the colorblind parenting that a lot of white parents espouse. But actually the research kind of suggests the exact opposite, that it's good to talk about race and it's good to talk about racism. But so many parents are like, that doesn't feel right. And that's so hard and how do I do that? That it's just really, really hard to kind of overcome that, what makes it hard, and also the complexity of it, I guess.
So along those lines, since you're, deeply entrenched in both of these worlds, like, how do you feel like your career as, a science journalist has informed your parenting, and kind of vice versa? You mentioned at the beginning that, you had a little bit of a sort of career shift in your focus when you had children. So I think we were just curious as to how being a parent has impacted you and how your career has impacted being a parent.
Yeah. I mean, well, in terms of like how all the research I've done has affected me, that's been interesting because on the one hand, like I kind of expected that after spending like a year entrenched in the research and reading about the sort of, quote unquote, most constructive ways to handle situations, that like I would be suddenly like, I would know what to do all the time. And I would handle things the way I want to handle them all the time. And I would be this like magical new mom. And that was totally not what happened. I mean, yes, I have definitely changed the ways I handle certain things, but I think so much of parenting is reactive and emotional, especially like when we're exhausted and dealing with 80 million things during the pandemic. And sometimes we just can't access like the rational parts of our brain when we are responding to our kids and when they're pushing our buttons. And so that was really interesting to see. Like it was a really slow evolution over time of like me learning maybe a new skill or approach. And then, actually being able to use it took a lot longer. And there were a lot of times when I would do the exact opposite of what I knew the research said. And I was like, why can't I do this? And then, over time, it got a little easier to do it, but like I would still sometimes like to say, but it was just a really slow process. And I thought that was really interesting because I do think, I think it's just that so much of our behavior as parents is, habitual and reactive, and it can be very, very hard to change. But I did start to see that things got easier. And now, like, I think one way my parenting has changed is I think I have more patience in some ways for a lot of my kids' quote unquote bad behavior, because one of the big things I learned, like learning about the neuroscience of development and how kids' brains develop, is that a lot of behavior is rooted in just kids not having the skills that we think they should have at a certain age, and also maybe like not having a need fully met. And a lot of what we consider like bad behavior is really just a reflection of like their brains can't do this. Like they don't have the impulse control. They don't have, the access to that part of their brain yet very well. And so what we sort of perceive of as like they're defying us, or they're not listening to us and they're doing it on purpose, is really just like they're kids and they have very different brains than we do. So that was, I think that's been a really helpful realization for me, because it makes me a little less reactive when I'm like, wait a minute, she's not melting down because she's trying to ruin dinner. She's melting down because she's hungry and she's tired and it's like 7 p.m.,
I would agree. I mean, I feel like that has been one of the things that's made me a little bit more patient, or hopefully made me a little bit more patient, is understanding the biology sometimes just behind behavior, right? That it's not, intentional misbehavior or whatever. It's, it's rooted in just development and where children are, where they should be at that stage of development.
Yeah.
And then also, shifting the focus to the parent too, like when we're getting upset. And most of the time for me, it's I have unmet needs. I am so depleted that I no longer have the bandwidth to be able to show up and parent the way that I know that I need to parent. And so it makes me, when I'm being reactive, say, okay, what do I need right now? What can I do so that, I can show up and be the best parent for them?
Yes, absolutely. That too. Yep.
So I think this sort of nicely ties into a question that we always sort of have for folks. And that is, if you could give parents just, 3 sort of pieces of advice based on your, experiences in your career and as well as being a parent, sort of what would those be?
Okay. Yeah. One big one, whenever you feel like, okay, maybe there's something happening in the world, or there's a topic that I feel like my kid isn't ready to hear, or, I don't want to take away their innocence and talk about this thing. And the things basically that you feel like you want to shield your kids from generally are the things that you should lean into and have conversations about. That is one big theme too, that I learned from research on all different kinds of things. So whether it's like talking about racism, or whether it's talking about, sexism or sex or pornography or what's going on in the world today, like generally speaking, it's better to try to talk to kids about these things, the things that you want to avoid, because those are the things that if you're not talking to your kids about them, they're going to be getting their information from somewhere else that's maybe not nearly as trustworthy. They're going to be hearing things from friends, or they're going to get stuff from the media. And so you want to really put your voice in there as one of the strongest. So that's one. I think another is just remembering that, there's no such thing as a perfect parent. There's no such thing as a perfect kid. I always like to explain that, like, the title of my book is not really like how to raise kids who aren't going to act like assholes as kids, because I think that's impossible. Like, kids are supposed to make mistakes, and they're all, and their brains aren't developed in the way that we sometimes think that they should be. And they're going to quote unquote misbehave, because that's what it is to be a child. It's really more, my book is more like how to raise kids who won't grow up to be assholes. Anyway, my point being that, like, mistakes are going to happen on, our side, on their side, and that's okay. And that's how we learn. And it's also really constructive for kids to see us make mistakes, and to hear us admit that we're making mistakes, and that we're works in progress, and that, we're not always going to do things perfectly, and to see us take responsibility for those mistakes too. Like, when I yell at my kids, which happens more than I wish it would, afterwards, I always try to apologize and take responsibility, and talk through with them, like, what could I do next time to help me calm down, and sort of use that as like a moment, where a teaching moment, right? Where we can talk through, like, why did I get so upset, and what could I do to calm myself down, and showing that I take responsibility for it too. So I think that's something else that's really important.
That was great. Yeah, I was like listening intently. I'm like, okay, yeah, no, I didn't see that.
check and check.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We so enjoyed your conversation, and I know all of our listeners will. So I'm sure everyone's going to want to know more about you, know where to get your work. So where would you send folks?
I think the easiest place to go is my website, which is melindawennermoyer.com. And there's a link to purchase links for my book, which is really available at any bookstore. There's also an audiobook and an ebook. I also have a newsletter where I am addressing various issues in child development, answering questions essentially, and responding to things in the news. And you can sign up for my newsletter through my website. So that's probably just the easiest place to go.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was really fun. Thank you so much for having me.
We enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.